It's good to see everybody, and the topic is really going to be uh, polarization, which you may have noticed is going on in our contemporary society, and reconciliation. And eventually, it will be the relationship between reconciliation with God and reconciliation with one another. But we're gonna start with the problem that there is a notable lack of reconciliation going on in the world right now. That alienation, tension, polarization, even hatred is about as bad as I have ever seen it in the United States, with the possible exception of 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. There were disturbances in cities, looting, the weathermen and other radical groups were blowing up ROTC buildings, demonstrations in the streets, the Vietnam War was raging. That was bad. This may be worse, actually, because the underlying issues seem to be multiple, and they seem to be deep and deepening all the time. So it's with some trepidation that I wade into the waters of polarization, which of course has a political and religious dimension to it, and the topic of reconciliation, or what as Christians do we do about it? So first, the problem, and the problem's deep. I have a colleague, not at my school, but teaching in another school, who teaches ethics. And he lives in a neighborhood that is largely progressive democratic, as are many neighborhoods that are populated with faculty members. For years, he has been helping an elderly neighbor shovel snow. And this guy's a professor of ethics. An elderly neighbor shovel snow whenever it snows. This year, he told me he had stopped doing that because his neighbor has a "Stop the Steal" sign in his front yard. So I take it that that's symptomatic of something very, very deep. And all of us probably know or have heard of families that are divided down the middle, blue state, red state people. All of it, there might, I suspect that this is not terribly true at Derry, because I know your congregation somewhat, but there are congregations that have split over political issues. It used to be the case that Christians would split over theological issues, like what's the significance of Christ? How should you understand the Eucharist and baptism? Should you baptize adults or babies? Should you respect or venerate the elements in the Lord's Supper? Should you have a congregational polity, a presbyterial polity, an episcopal polity, or what? That's what used to divide Christians. Now it seems to be politics and culture, and issues like, should there be a mandatory mask mandate or not? Should you wear a mask or not? When should things reopen, and under what circumstances? Who should be impeached? Should there be a recount? Should there be election fraud reform? Issues like that are now the things that are causing Christians and families to experience alienation and polarization. And therefore, the theme of reconciliation is on the front burner for everybody. I want to say a couple of things about that. Number one, Christianity through its history has often contributed to polarization. Sometimes Christianity has been in the forefront of dividing people. Protestants versus Catholics, Lutherans versus Reformed people, everybody versus Mennonites, fundamentalists versus liberals. And often that has led to crusades, bloodshed, accusations of heresy, burning people at the stake, hanging alleged witches. So Christianity in itself does not have an unsullied track record in regard to reconciliation and the avoidance of polarization. But in spite of that, Christianity, on its good days, has contributed to a culture of reconciliation and moderation. There have always been bright spots in the history of Christianity, folk who would come out of the woodwork and say, we really should love our enemies and not kill them. And we shouldn't call them children of Satan. And we shouldn't be anti-Semitic. And we Protestants should not be anti-Catholic. There have always been voices, sometimes voices crying in the wilderness, but there have always been voices of reconciliation. In the history of Christianity, what looms large is people like Erasmus in the period of the Reformation, who said that Catholics and Protestants really should figure out a way to get along and not raise armies to slaughter one another. Or on the Episcopal side, Richard Hooker, who said that there's room in England for people who want bishops and people who don't. Or in the or on the Lutheran side, not Luther himself, who was very polemical and very divisive, but his best friend and colleague, Philip Melanchthon, who actually tried to work out theological compromise with Roman Catholics. Or closer to home, right here in Pennsylvania, and now I'm going to brag about my school, Lancaster Theological Seminary, which was in the 19th century located in Mercersburg, was among the first in Protestant America in the 1840s to say that the Pope might not be the Antichrist, and that maybe we really shouldn't try to keep Irish Catholics out of the country. Maybe we should, and maybe we actually have something to learn from Catholics. So Catholic-Protestant dialogue was started by some of my vocational ancestors at Lancaster Seminary. And maybe most importantly, Presbyterians by the 20th century, by the mid-20th century, got at the head of the train on this reconciliation movement with the Confession of 1967, which is in your Book of Confessions, the main theme of which is reconciliation. That's the theme that drives the whole confession. In fact, sometimes that confession is called the Reconciliation Confession. It starts with reconciliation with God, and then it moves to reconciliation with enemies of the nation. Remember, this was the Cold War, and racial reconciliation. So Presbyterians are no stranger to this theme of reconciliation and staring the problem in the face, saying it's not just reconciliation with God, it's reconciliation with one another when our divisions seem intractable and resistant to any kind of healing. So here's the plan for the next 4 weeks. Today, we're going to talk about some low-level practical strategies to lower the temperature, to pave the way for reconciliation. Because when things are really heated up and tempers are flaring, it's hard to engage in any reconciliation. And then in the next weeks, we're going to talk about the emotional side and spiritual side of reconciliation. How can prayer and spirituality and spiritual practices lower our suspicion and hostility towards those who disagree with us? And then lastly, we're going to root the whole thing in what Christians have and should believe about reconciliation with God and how that spills over into our reconciliation with one another. And that'll be the more difficult and somewhat more abstract stuff. But for today, we're going to start with more concrete, strategic things to lower the temperature so that reconciliation might be possible. And we're going to start with just the simple phenomenon of how do you talk as a Christian with people who profoundly disagree with you about cultural and political matters, because those are the things that are really splitting people these days. And how can we talk with each other without killing each other, and maybe even learn to appreciate one another? So I'm going to articulate about, I don't know, 6 or 7 principles about how to have a conversation with people whose opinions you might really find to be reprehensible. How do you talk with them in a spiritually healthy way that might lead to some kind of reconciliation? I'm going to make 6 or 7 points, some of which I think are pretty obvious. And then we can talk about them, whether you find them to be plausible, helpful, naive, or what. And the first principle for, I think, for a conversation with those who are very different, this one's simple, but it's primary, is nonviolence. And I feel somewhat strange having to say that because it seems self-evident, but to many people these days, it's not, as the events of January 6th demonstrated. And it's not just physical violence, it's also don't engage in psychological violence, don't engage in emotional violence, don't engage in any kind of manipulation. So, what I have in mind is, for example, and oh, by the way, I'm going to have a lot of depressing anecdotes. So if you're depressed at the end of this, hang on, because eventually grace is going to show up. This is kind of an evangelical pattern. First the bad news, then the good news. First the sin, then the grace. So here's another depressing anecdote. I was in a bakery downtown in Lancaster, very good bakery, which had some mild political signs up. They weren't endorsing any particular candidate. They were just saying things like, everyone is welcomed here, and love your neighbor no matter who they are. Two gentlemen walked in who, I hate to stereotype them, but they looked to me like they were from a motorcycle gang. And they said to me, or they said to, I was in the store, and they said to the proprietor, unless you take those signs down, we will persuade all our friends to never set foot in this store or buy anything. And then they said, and in fact, your pastries look so tasty, it would be a shame if something bad happened to them. And then they took some cupcakes without paying for them and walked out. That was almost physical violence, but it was an example of a threat that we will withdraw economic support, we won't patronize your store, and we'll tell all our friends not to either, unless you come round politically or are overtly neutral. And the sad thing was, they thought that love your neighbor was a political statement. So that's using economic violence and social violence, including using inflammatory speech is another example of violence. So all that has to be renounced if there's going to be anything positive that happens. Politicians, for example, should stop threatening to withdraw political support for certain candidates unless they shape up. That's no way to have a healthy political conversation. So threats of, we'll withdraw our political support, we'll withdraw our economic support, or I know of one family where a parent said to a child, I will not love you anymore if you vote the way you are thinking of voting. That's emotional violence. All that has to be renounced if there is going to be anything positive happens. And A second principle I'd like to suggest is identify what the real problem is. Often folk talk around problems or they address a symptom of a deeper problem, and the real issue never gets acknowledged, and therefore it never gets dealt with, and it just continues to fester. Um, let me give an interpersonal example from myself in which I come out looking not so very noble. Um, Years ago, I took a class of students on a cross-cultural trip to Central America. We were gone for 3 weeks, came back to the airport in the United States, and most of my students' relatives were there to pick them up and expressed uh, affection and glad to see them and glad you're safe. And there was much hugging and displays of emotion. Um, However, my wife wasn't there to pick me up. And I took a taxi home and got there, knocked on the door. She answered and looked at me and said, "Where's my toothbrush?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "You took it. You took my toothbrush." And I said, "Oh, I'm very sorry I took your toothbrush." And I proceeded to tell her about the adventures and learnings that we'd had on the trip. And she would interrupt me periodically and say, "You took my toothbrush." And I'm not a keen reader of human behavior, but I eventually concluded that something's amiss here. So finally, I just stopped and said, "Look, I hope you bought a new toothbrush. I'll reimburse you for the toothbrush. I'll give you your old toothbrush back after it's been boiled. Um, and but what's really the problem here?" And finally, she confessed it wasn't the toothbrush. That was a symptom. The real problem was I hadn't told her I was going to Central America. And for a day, a 24-hour period, she didn't know where I was. And she had to call up the school and find out my whereabouts. So the toothbrush wasn't the problem. The fact that I had failed to communicate clearly where I was going to be was the problem. And therefore, the deepest problem of all was communication. Now, until that was addressed, I mean, we could have gone on for years arguing about the toothbrush. So also in our contemporary cultural political scene, I think there are a lot of issues that are symptomatic of deeper issues, but those deeper issues usually don't get addressed. Even if everybody sort of suspects what they are or even knows what they are, they still aren't the thing that's talked about. I'm thinking like statehood for Puerto Rico. And the divides about that. That's not really the issue. The issue is the balance in the Electoral College and what constitutes an equitable, just, fair balance in the Electoral College. And until that's just talked about straight up, nothing healthy is going to happen in regard to Puerto Rico. Or more broadly, immigration reform. The real issue behind that for many people, I think, is how much multiculturalism can the United States absorb? How much multiculturalism can a society stand until it starts to fall apart at the seams? That's the issue. And until that one's addressed, there won't be any significant immigration reform. So identify what the real underlying problem is and deal with that rather than the more surface symptoms. So that was rule number 2. Rule number 3 is, I hope, self-evident, and it's clarify what you mean in a debate. Don't use vague, abstract slogans that could mean an infinite number of things. So, for example, make America great again. Great? Great in what respect? What does great mean? And there have been countless disputes about whether America is great or not, or if it lapsed and used to be great and now it isn't, and now it's recovering. But until great is given some sort of definition, nobody knows what's being talked about. Does great mean militarily powerful? Does great mean having an aggressive foreign policy? Does great mean having an ever increasing gross national product? Does great mean Wall Street is booming? Does great mean Main Street is booming? Does great mean white? Does great mean rural village culture? What does great mean? Until those things are specified, nothing's going to happen. And the problem of vagueness occurs on all sides, occurs on the right, occurs on the left, and even occurs in the middle. And in the middle, it's actually maybe even worse than on the right and the left, because the middle wants to avoid conflict. And therefore, one way to do that is to be deliberately vague. But until folks specify what they really mean, we don't even know what we're arguing about. And another one is be honest. Confess where you stand. Let your own convictions show. Don't hide them. You know, if you're a conservative Republican, say, you need to know as we start this conversation, I'm a conservative Republican. Or if you're a progressive Democrat, say, you need to know I'm a progressive Democrat. Or if you're an independent, just say, you need to know I'm an independent. Don't hide it, and make it clear what for you is more or less non-negotiable. So there are many things about which we can have conversations, but there are some things about which we can't, because the beliefs are too irreconcilable, too beyond the pale. Like, I have many conservative Republican friends with whom I can have conversations. I have many left-leaning Democratic friends with whom I can have conversations. I can't really have a fruitful conversation with somebody from QAnon. Maybe that's a lapse on my part or a failing, but when the conversation turns to Jews are using rays from space to start forest fires in California, I don't know how to engage in that conversation. To do so would cause me to sacrifice almost everything I know and believe, and therefore the conversation would be a sham. So we need to know and admit where we stand, and therefore what are the limits of a fruitful conversation. In theology, I can have conversations with all sorts of different kinds of folk. One kind of folk I have difficulty with are actually Mormons. When they say the angel Moroni showed up in New York with golden tablets and showed them to Joseph Smith, and he read them out to his wife, and she transcribed them, and then they disappeared forever. So nobody ever had access to them except him. My inclination is just say, yeah, right. I don't know what to do with that. The disappearing golden tablets that only Joseph Smith saw. So there are limits to conversations. Usually it involves the extremes. The great American philosopher Richard Rorty, who was one of the primary champions of a wide-ranging, open-minded, freewheeling conversation with just about everybody, was once asked, "How do you talk with Nazis?" And he thought for a minute, and his response was, "You don't talk with Nazis, you shoot them." And that was a very dramatic and kind of hyperbolic way of suggesting there are some folk with whom conversations just won't work because the basic convictions are too irreconcilable. But those, let us pray, are few and far between. And now comes probably one of the more controversial principles and one of the most difficult to actually put into practice. Is this. I'm going to call it humility about what you believe. Although all of us have some non-negotiable core beliefs, we believe a lot of things that aren't necessarily at our cores, where we might want to say to ourselves, I might just be wrong about this. And as you enter into a conversation with someone whose stances are very different from your own, you might want to go out of your way to remind yourself there are many things about which I am probably mistaken. I don't know everything. I am not God. I am not omniscient. Henry VIII allegedly once said to Thomas More, who was then his chancellor, um, when Henry had one of his own musical compositions played for More, and More said that he thought it was wonderful, but then added that his taste in music was reputedly to be deplorable. And Henry VIII said, um, "Nonsense, Thomas. Your taste in music is wonderful because it exactly coincides with my own, and my own exactly coincides with God's." Um, so that notion that our opinions and tastes and values exactly coincide with God's is actually dangerous. I'd be very much surprised if on Judgment Day I show up before the ultimate judge, and God looks at me and says, "Congratulations, you figured it out in absolutely. You got everything right. You voted for all the candidates that I, God, would have endorsed. Um, and all your beliefs are absolutely accurate. Congratulations." Uh, that would be very surprising. And that should be very unthinkable to Reformed Christians like Presbyterians, who have two beliefs when you put them together equal, I don't know everything. One is Presbyterians typically believe that sin remains even in the saints, that even the best Presbyterian on earth is still a sinner. And the other conviction is sin affects everything, not just our bodies, not just our physical lives, not just our instinctive lives, but even the way we think. So that even the best Presbyterians' thought processes are somewhat distorted by their own sinfulness. That we all, for example, have a tendency to interpret things in ways that benefit ourselves. I know that in economic matters, the first thing I think of is this economic policy going to benefit me and my family? But then I have to catch myself and say, that's the wrong question. The question should be, does this economic policy benefit humanity in general? But it's hard to do that. So all of us engage in special pleading for ourselves when we think about economic and political matters, and we need to be aware of that. So simply, we should always say to ourselves, I could be wrong about something. In fact, given the fact that I'm sinful and my sinfulness affects my thought processes, odds are I'm wrong about a good many things that I don't even suspect that I could be wrong about. So another way to put this is we should always be attentive to the possible flaws in our own ideological positions. And that opens up to the most difficult principle, which is when we engage in conversation with somebody who's very different from ourselves in their convictions, values, political persuasion, culture, we should always be attentive to the ways in which their views could help us understand what's flawed about our own views. What they're articulating, even if we don't agree with it, it might point out that, oh yeah, I didn't take that consideration into account. Oh yeah, I never thought of that. And oh yeah, there might be something to that. And that means being open to the possibility that even the people we disagree with the most might be right about some things and might have something to teach us. So we must be open to the possibility of learning from even the people whose own positions seem most alien to our own. And that's often a difficult and painful thing. I have lots of relatives on both sides, lots of conservative Republican relatives and progressive Democratic relatives who think that their position is absolutely correct and that therefore there can be no compromise, no negotiation, nothing to learn from the other side. So it's a sort of openness to the other. Now, when that happens, if there is an exchange of views, then something new might just emerge. And it wouldn't necessarily be a compromise, a middle of the road. It's not as if the Democrats say that the minimum wage should be $15 an hour, and Republicans say maybe 12, but no more than that, so that the compromise would be, I don't know, 13.5. We're not talking about compromise. It's just that something entirely novel and not thought of previously, a new possibility, a win-win might emerge. Not the middle of the road, but some position that does justice to the pros in each of the positions and avoids the cons in both positions. Now, what that is usually unimaginable until after the conversation has happened. So the conversation has to happen first, and then maybe new possibilities can be imagined that nobody had thought of before that are somewhat satisfying to both parties. And it probably would not be an anemic compromise middle of the road, although sometimes that's the best you can do. The great theoretician of this was a German philosopher in the early 19th century, G.W.F. Hegel, who said that progress is made when you have a position, which he calls the thesis, and then somebody thinks of the opposite position called the antithesis, then the two interact with one another and cross-fertilize one another and produces a novel third thing, which he called the synthesis. And that's been kind of corroborated by social scientists who investigate group process and group process conversations, and generally conclude that a decision that emerges from people who are very, very different is usually better and more fruitful than a decision that emerges from people who are all the same. Or to use the title of a famous book about Lincoln, a team of rivals usually produces a better solution than does an homogeneous group or a single individual. You've probably experienced something like that in church council meetings or town council meetings or the PTA or anything where the best decision emerges through the interaction of a variety of viewpoints, if it can happen in a fruitful, respectful manner. A couple of final observations. One is obvious, I hope. All of this involves not calling your conversation partners names. Don't demonize them, especially not to their face, but better yet, don't even think it. So for example, and this happened recently, you probably saw in the news, Representative Kinzinger from New York was condemned by his own cousins in a letter that he published in the New York Times, I think it was. He is a Republican, but he voted to impeach former President Trump. Some of his Republican relatives then wrote him a letter saying that he was an enemy of God and had joined Satan's army. So using phrases like that are generally not helpful in conversation. Don't say that someone is a child of Satan, joined Satan's army, or anything remotely like that. And it's best to not stereotype, not say, oh, I know what kind of person this is, and I know what they believe, and I know what they're going to say. Stereotyping is dangerous, but hard to avoid. I know I do it. Every time I'm driving on the highway and I get cut off suddenly by someone who's speeding, I assume automatically that it's a male teenager with a baseball cap on backwards. And that's often not the case, because then, being from New Jersey, my instinct is to retaliate and cut them off, which I do. But then as I cut them off, I realize, oh no, that's a middle-aged woman in a professional suit. It's not a kid in a baseball cap. So we have to catch ourselves assuming that we know the social location or the cultural characteristics of the people we're talking with. Now, these were just programmatic principles for how to have a civil conversation. I want to say a couple of concluding things about them. One is, there's no guarantees these are going to work. And they're really for ourselves rather than for the other. What doesn't work is to say, I'm not going to engage in conversation with you unless you agree with these principles. You got to not call me names. You got to admit that I might be right about some things. You've got to confess that you might be wrong about some things. We're not going to stereotype. If you wait for the parties you're talking with to agree to that, then probably no conversation will ever get off the ground. So these are things we should implement ourselves in our own lives and hope that it will inspire other people to do the same, but it might not. So there's no magic bullet. There's no panacea here. So these were marching orders for ourselves, things that we can do about our own behavior, which I hope would lead to the virtue of humility. That's historically has been a primary Christian virtue. Don't be puffed up, don't be arrogant, don't be prideful. Admit that you're fallible, admit that you're sometimes wrong, be humble. And we'll see that that's also has to be balanced by a hope in God's grace. So you have to believe that God is at work somewhere, even in the most difficult and unpromising and dire seeming situations, that God can bring good out of evil, and that God can bring reconciliation out of polarization. Because if it's up to us, then we're all in trouble. So Christians, I think, need to enter into conflictual situations and conversations, saying to themselves, I need to be humble. I'm fallible. Only God is perfect. I'm not. And God's grace might just be at work here, and something surprisingly good might come of this, even though realistically, I don't quite see it. But God's grace works in surprising ways. So humility and hope, I think, have to underlie all these principles. And maybe, just maybe, they will sometimes work. Actually, I think I've seen it happen a few times, and there are surprises. So today, we've just been talking about how to have interaction with folk from whom you are, let's say, ideologically, culturally, politically estranged, and how some kind of reconciliation might begin to take root. And in subsequent weeks, we're going to be talking more about the spiritual and theological dimensions of this, and the ultimate reconciliation, which is reconciliation with God, which has to undergird all our efforts to be reconciled with people. But today, this was sort of low-level programmatic reflections on how not to kill your neighbors whose political signs might be different from your own. Um, in just as an aside, in Lancaster, all the signs are about 90% of the political signs point in one direction. Only 10% point in the opposite direction. However, I drove out into Western Pennsylvania and it was still 90-10, but it was in the opposite direction. However, the last time I drove up the Harrisburg Pike towards Hershey, it was 50-50. So I'm suspecting that you folk in Hershey might be living in an area where the divide is about evenly divided, and therefore conversations and interactions with folk who believe differently from you are very, very likely, more likely than they are for me, actually. So now what I'd like to do now is just throw the conversation open to responses, questions, observations, polemical abuse, name calling. Yeah, Patty Joe.
I had a friend put on Facebook how she was finished eating breakfast outdoors at a restaurant, and she had her mask on, and she was standing along the road, and a guy drove past in a red pickup truck and gave her the finger. And she thinks it's because she was wearing her mask. And I know that's a divisive thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just an indication of how deep the problem goes and how difficult it would be to have a conversation with that, for your friend with the mask,
Right.
to have a conversation with the person who gave her the finger.
Mm-hmm.
But unless those kinds of interactions and conversations happen, I think our culture is in deep, deep trouble. Debbie.
Do you think, are we looking at generations to get out of this? I had an opportunity to reflect on someone that I met. We were writing devotional things, and it took me back to a trip to Northern Ireland back in the late 90s. And we had the opportunity to meet John Hume, and we stayed at a place called Corrymeela.
Oh, yeah.
Which was the reconciliation community. And and thinking about how many years in a lifetime of work it took for from grassroots and from the top down to kind of work towards a reconciliation. I don't know anybody yet from the top who's working towards that, like a politician, like a John Hume, who's making it his life's work to do this. But it looks like it may, from the grassroots, it may bubble up some, but I'm thinking these are lifetimes to try and get there.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's the pessimistic part. But remember, there is grace, providence, and we're going to get to hope later. Pessimistic part is what makes the division worse is it tends to be somewhat regional. And the folks in different regions don't interact with one another all that much anymore. Not as much as they used to. So the cultural division is tending to be sort of, on the one hand, rural and village, small town, versus urban and middle-class suburbs. And the kids go to different school systems. They shop in different stores. They don't meet each other except if a person in a pickup truck is driving by a restaurant where somebody's wearing a mask. The place where it could happen and should happen is churches. But it's mostly not. In fact, I know of churches that are going in the opposite direction and becoming more and more polarized, where I have one, he himself is, would self-describe as a progressive Christian, and said some things from the pulpit that caused about 1/3 of his congregation to leave. And there were political things. And his response was good riddance.
Mm, mm,
That I don't want them in my congregation anyway. They hold everybody else back and prevent us from doing anything constructive. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum, on the right, there are lots of congregations and religious groups that come so close to political endorsements that they're in danger of jeopardizing their tax-exempt status.
Mm.
In fact, there are a lot of congregations that should have had their tax-exempt status pulled, but it hasn't been because they have endorsed political candidates, which is a no-no.
Mm.
So it's in churches where that kind of how can people get together and talk, which was Corey Mila's main claim to fame. It got both sides in the Irish Civil War to talk to each other. That could happen in churches, but it's largely not. Either churches are themselves becoming polarized, and congregations are taking stances. So you got, the liberal Democratic congregation and the conservative Republican congregation, or else the problem's just ignored.
I have an observation. This is Kathy Olson.
Yeah.
Last night I saw the movie Gandhi with Ben Kingsley, 3.5 hours. I think if every one of us watched the movie Gandhi every day, we would all be a lot better off. His life goal was to have tolerance between the Hindus and the Muslims in India. And he went on hunger fasts to promote that cause. It really makes you think a lot about what can be done between different groups.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. There are things that can be done and things that have been done. And Gandhi was on the right track. It's sad that tragic that he was assassinated and his vision didn't get entirely implemented. But for a while it was, and it still can be. Anybody have
So Charlie has a hand up.
Who does?
It's like Charlie Coke.
Oh, Charlie.
Yes. No.
He's muted.
Charlie.
Charlie, are you muted?
I can't tell.
Okay. Anyway, Charlie, if you can hear us, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you now.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it must have been tied up with my earphones. Anyway, one of the things that Corey Melia, I think, had going for it is there was a community of diverse points of view that were less involved with their point of view than it was community.
Yeah.
So you weren't sitting there in a constant debate situation. And it's where I like mission projects. You don't need to have virtually anything in common except the project. And the balance of importance becomes the project, and you start seeing people in that light as opposed to the political position. And so you build a relationship. And I think that's the way I viewed Corey relative to the modern societal thing for the US. We are courtesy of the internet. You can find numbers that lean every direction in the world. So even those with a real dedication to listening to and processing numbers can't do it because the numbers are so bad and so unreliable that you end up just kind of throwing your hands up and picking one. And the people that are willing to pick one and defend it endlessly, your QAnon thing, when you are absolutely sure you're right, even though the numbers cannot be verified any other way, the problem is nobody knows what true numbers are. Sorry, I'm not sure there's a question in there, but anyway.
No, you're entirely right, and that just exacerbates the problem, because what you're pointing to is the phenomenon of siloing, which social media has made worse and made possible, where number one, as you rightly pointed out, there can be legitimate controversy about empirical matters like percentages and how many people actually did what and how much fraud was there in voting. There can be legitimate disagreements about that. But when folk can silo themselves and only listen to people who believe exactly as they do, then prejudices get reinforced and there's no conversation across ideological boundaries. And that's problematic. What to do about that is a very tricky problem, but it is a problem. So our problem isn't just regional. It's like country and village versus cities. It's also a social media problem. Which news outlets do you listen to? Which chat rooms are you on? And to tell the truth, I think that's an educational problem. That's a problem for school systems. As somebody pointed out, I forgot who, for the last 20 years, most educational funding and innovation has been devoted to the sciences, computer science particularly, and business. The humanities have suffered. The result is people don't know how to think. And a lot of people don't see the value in absorbing and evaluating a variety of different opinions because they never had to do that. They didn't even have to do that in school. And that's scary. Don't know how that, maybe they should look at something conservative and something progressive and think about them and evaluate their pros and cons. They don't know how to do that. And it doesn't even occur to them that they should do that. Yeah, Eleanor.
You're muted, Eleanor.
I think you're still muted.
You're still muted. There you go. We can hear you now.
I'm thinking about the issue of communication and how we engage with each other, which seems, in my mind, the more the young people spend writing rather than speaking, the harder the issues are going to be. I think that if people engage with how, what, when, and where rather than why, which is always threatening,
Excuse me, Eleanor. It's almost 10 o'clock and we get cut off automatically at 10, but I want you
All
to
right.
go, I want you to go ahead. Go ahead with your comments. Go ahead.
Why is threatening, and it pushes people away because they don't know how to justify whatever it is that's so emotionally important to them.
Yeah.
That's it's just an experience that I know about.
And that's what we're going to look at next week. That's a perfect segue. Thank you. That one of the things that has to happen is in interactions with people who are politically different, culturally different, ideologically different, get at, have an honest exposure of what is it that's really emotionally fueling the whole thing. You know, what fear, what hope is driving you to this position? And that has to happen on both sides. Why do you feel this way? Why do you feel so strongly about it?
That doesn't work.
Yeah. And that, well, it's extraordinarily difficult.
No.
But until that happens, I think we're all in serious trouble. So I'm sorry to be sounding doom and gloom, but I think we all know we got a problem. However, we're Christians, we're Reformed Christians, and we believe in the sovereignty of God and God's providence. And therefore, there is hope, even in the bleakest of situations. And the situation we're in right now has become pretty bleak, I think.
Okay, it is 10 o'clock. I was told we automatically get cut off, but I think we're on borrowed time here. But any regard, next week, that's all. Tune in again for next week. We had a good class attendance today, and that's pretty much it. And thank everybody for your contributions. Marie, did you have something quick? Oops. Oh, she's waving goodbye. Never mind. Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.